You're listening to the Apple and Biscuit Show with Jason Nicholas and Dr. Neil Hillman.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to the Apple and Biscuit Show. I'm Dr. Neil Hillman.
And I'm Jason Nicholas.
We're two experienced film and television sound professionals with an insatiable curiosity for everything and anything aural, whether it's the way that sound design is implemented in a movie, to evoke emotional response in an audience, for instance, or the way that the characteristics of sound can influence human behaviour in our everyday lives.
So hopefully the content of our podcast and the guests who join us will prove enlightening to anyone with an interest in sound, regardless of your level of experience. Maybe you're a student just embarking on your studies, an industry newcomer, or you're already an experienced professional. Maybe you just love movies. Wherever you join us from, you're welcome. And as always, we know that there'll be plenty that we can learn from today's guest.
Today, we're speaking with Mark Franken, the Emmy-winning creator of the sound editing software tools EdiCue, EdiLoad and EdiPrompt. Products that since their inception in 2007 have come to be indispensable to dialogue editors, supervising sound editors, ADR recordists and re-recording mixers working in the sound for moving picture sector. And each of these products is born out of the experience of Mark Franken as a highly successful sound creative in both hemispheres. Mark, are you well, and where in the world do we find you today?
Oh, I'm very well, thank you. You'll find me at home in my office. I'm currently in northern New South Wales, about 6 hours drive north of Sydney.
But Mark, before we talk about your fascinating backstory as a sound editor, re-recording mixer and software developer, could you first give us a brief overview of the three Sounds in Sync products that moving picture sound editors all over the world will recognise? That's EdiCue, EdiLoad and EdiPrompt. Just to provide a context, could you give us a brief summary of what they're designed to do and how they differ?
So EdiCue is designed for queuing ADR. So that will be done by a dialogue editor or a sound supervisor to go through a TV episode or film to locate where dialogue needs to be re-recorded. And so EdiCue is used to help with that process of creating those cues, and it could also export all the different files, PDFs required for the actual ADR record. Then EdiPrompt is a partner in terms of it's used during the recording process. So it'll load files created by EdiCue, and it'll display visual prompts, audio beeps, and text on screen, kind of a bit like a kind of karaoke thing. So the actors can actually see all the cues and text on screen and not looking down on a page. And it also helps the recordist to automate the process with Pro Tools. And then lastly, EdiLoad's, there's a whole bunch of features in that helps sound post editors to do their tasks, but the main one would be it can assemble all the location WAV files to match the sound edits made by the picture editor. So it'll propagate all of the channels that were recorded on location which weren't part of the actual picture edit.
Thanks for that, Mark. That sets a context. And of course, I should say welcome to the show as well. So sorry about that. You had an early interest in coding whilst you were still at school. Can you tell us about your formative years in New Zealand and those first steps in writing code?
Well, it's an interesting point in my primary schooling. There was a new guy in our class, and he was telling me about he had a computer at home. And I was really intrigued by how you could write programs to get a computer to do what you ask, basically. And he wrote me a little program that's just drew a little box in BASIC. A very simple program, but it stuck with me to when I was at high school, and our school acquired a couple of Apple IIes. This was pre-Macintosh and mice. And the first program I wrote was a music notation software app where you could key in all the notes on a stave and print out a musical score. And I even entered it in a science fair in Christchurch. And but yeah, that's as far as that one went.
Now, computers and sound seem to have been two enduring interests, and there was a move from New Zealand to Australia in there early on too. When was that, and how did your entry into professional sound work come about?
Well, yeah, end of 87, I moved to Sydney. My My sister was living in Sydney at the time, and I came over for a holiday and loved it that much that I packed my bags and moved over a month later. And during the day I was fixing computers, and in the evening, or a couple of evenings a week, I did a course with the School of Audio Engineering, the SAE, and I did their 1-year diploma course and then a 3-month Tonmeister course. And at the end of that, there was an advert for a job at Sony Music in their mastering department, which I just jumped at and landed a job there. And so that was the beginning of my whole sound editing career. At the time, of course, just working purely in music. And so I started off compiling CDs and creating albums. And I'd been there working a couple of weeks, and I noticed my boss, Louis, who's still a good mate of mine, he lives up the road, he was installing these Novell networks. And I happened to say to him, hey, if you want a hand with setting up this network, this is pre-Windows or anything. I'd done this in New Zealand, and he kind of took note of it, but didn't really say much more. And a week later, he says, well, do you want to learn to cut records? And I said, yeah, of course. And I found out later on that he felt that if you're smart enough to hook a Novell network together, you must be smart enough to cut a record. So that was my absolute dream job, because I grew up in New Zealand with my dad. He had created this workshop at home with a metalworking lathe, woodworking lathe, milling machine, all sorts of things, which I loved creating things in the lathe. But this was just a perfect amalgamation of getting music to fit in this groove on a lacquer-coated aluminium disc while listening to music. It was like, man, you're going to pay me for this. So, yeah, I threw myself into that job. There wasn't actually a room available for me during the day, so I ended up doing nights. And I was the only one in this whole record pressing plant through the night. And so I'd sometimes just have several rooms running and learn everything about CD mastering and cutting records. It was a ball.
Well, vinyl mastering's, I was going to say vinyl mastering's kind of back in play right now. So if you want to use those skills again, they're in high demand. Then you moved to the UK, still as a music mastering engineer, but it wasn't long before you started working in audio post-production at the legendary London facility Telecine. How different was that to what you'd been doing up till then?
It was quite different, of course, because all of a sudden you're working with picture and you're learning the whole skill of knowing what's in sync, what isn't in sync, along with all the different video and audio formats and how to synchronize them. But I did learn a couple of things. At Tape One Studio, which was the studio I'd worked previously in London, they had an audio file which I'd used to compile CD masters. So that was a great skill to know when Telecine ended up buying two of them, one with a Logic 2 console, one with a Logic 3 console. And so I had that background to be able to then edit and mix documentaries. But the other interesting thing was that the equipment that was used to master CDs, which was the 1630 encoder created by Sony for the actual, when the CD format was made, I'd use that at Sony in Sydney and also at Tape One. But at Telecine, we used to make the Laserdisc masters. And I don't know how many of your listeners would be familiar with that, but it was a 12-inch disc, which would look kind of like a really large CD. And on that was digital audio, 16-bit 44.1 kilohertz, but it had analog video. And the interesting process was getting the audio, which was stored on a NTSC Betamax, black and white, with a PAL 1-inch video, and getting, two worlds to synchronize, which were never meant to synchronize. It was quite a bit of fun. But Telecine was just a great learning experience from all the different video formats, and they did a huge selection of jobs, and it was a great training.
Yeah, I think there's a whole interesting side discussion there about those things that weren't meant to, like, wasn't the Sony unit to master CDs recording onto U-matic? Was that?
Yeah, it was a black and white U-matic, so it was just storing you could watch the pictures, it was just this digital video stream that was getting stored. I guess it was just their way of finding something to store that information on that was really available in those days.
And then when you came back to Australia was that 1995 I have here?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was to work at a facility that edited and mixed soundtracks for television drama. And this would have been at a time where we didn't have many online resources as we do now to share knowledge, especially about these sort of niche areas of sound post-production. How did you find the workflows and the practice in the industry differed between the UK and Australia?
Well, I guess comparing it from the UK to Australia, you find that Australia, you're given a lot more free will of what you do. It's kind of like I felt in the UK, you kind of can get pigeonholed quite a bit in, like, well, no, that's your job and that's your job. But Australia, you're just given a lot more space to create different and try different things out. So it was an interesting time because Pro Tools wasn't, I guess you would say, the mainstay is what it is, particularly here in Australia. And so there were lots of different systems that were tried out and used at different points. Like at Labsonics where I was working, they had DAR. We started using Pro Tools. I think it was version 4 or 5 back in the OS 9 days. I'd used DSP, which I think got swallowed up by Fairlight at some point. Neil, you probably know the backstory on that. And of course, I'd used Audiophile as well. So it was interesting navigating which system to use or getting to know each one. But I think in terms of learning new things, Labsonics had a lot of freelancers come through, and some had worked on big feature films, and that's where you got to know new ways of working or sound design tricks and that kind of thing. And I think that was knowledge from different editors was the way we kind of found out about things back then.
It was a really interesting time. I mean, you talked a few of the workstations there. Things like AMS's Audiophile. I don't mean to sort of harp on about it, but I'm still amazed that Pro Tools has taken the grip that it has when there were so many more usable competitors at that time. And it just seems to me that Pro Tools' ascendancy has been a triumph of marketing over facilities, but now it is the industry standard, and we are where we are.
Well, yeah, I think it just happened that the computers became powerful enough for their software, and so their systems could expand just at the right point in time where you didn't need these audiophiles and DARs. They were very proprietary systems and were very expensive. And so I think Pro Tools just happened to just be in the right place at the right time with the way that they had developed their system.
So at the end of that decade, Mark, the 1990s, you went freelance as a sound editor, and obviously those years before had prepared you very well because you went on to work as a dialogue editor on some really notable movies, as well as being engaged as an effects editor and as a music editor. Can you tell us about some of those projects and what were some of the problems you encountered as a sound editor that maybe sparked that desire to create software that would assist in the post-production process?
Well, yeah, I was very fortunate with the films that I've worked on over the years. The first would have been Quiet American in Sydney, and then I landed a job. Well, I'd flown over to New Zealand several times to meet up with Mike Hopkins. Bless him, he's passed away, but that paid off, and I ended up getting a job on the second and third Lord of the Rings movies, and they were an absolute dream to work on them. and I could rabbit on forever about them. But
well, please do tell us, how you were engaged and what you were doing there. We'd love to know.
And it just specifically with Lord of the Rings, wasn't most of that ADR, wasn't it? It was.
Well, yeah, I think we pretty much did ADR the whole movie, all of them, because of just the locations, and of course all the studio stuff had fans and everything on it. But in the mix, they would try and use as much production as we could. But so there was a huge amount of ADR that was recorded. But yeah, coming back to your original question about the things that came up, the thing that was most obvious was the need to have some kind of automated way to chase the picture edit, because Peter had shot these 3 movies all in the one go. Okay, we were only cutting one movie at a time, but he had left the cuts very long. I think it was intentional, because he knew he wanted to make a DVD version of it. So he had the whole crew making a long, very long movie. So he had all those elements that he'd shorten it just before the theatrical release, and then, oh, presto, you could make it long again and create the DVD version. But because there was, I don't know, sometimes 12 reels, 20 minute reels. He had a special projector in his theatre that would load a 28 or 29 minute reel, because sometimes the storyline was such that you didn't want to just break or rebalance at the time. So you would have these rebalances or recuts, from one version of a film to the next version of the film. So between each version of the movie, you would have to sometimes take segments from, say, reels 3, 4, and 7, and they would become the new reel 4. And to do that manually was just, at the time you heard of these crazy big films in America, and they would just throw lots and lots of people at it. And, they've got the resources, well, particularly in those days. But being in New Zealand, okay, it was still quite a large crew, but you just had to find a better way. So out of that, the main thing that we came up with, and what I started doing, which I developed during the Quiet American in Sydney the year before, was I developed a Windows app that could compare an old version Picture EDL to a new version Picture EDL and create a change EDL. And that would load into a program called Titan that was created by Synchro Arts, ran OS 9 at the time, and that would recut your session to match the new picture cut. And, without that kind of technology, there was no way we could have made those movies. And, those films were, created technologies, so many technologies like that, and also in the visual effects department with Weta that, are just so evident today.
I think that's absolutely fascinating to hear about Peter Jackson's production processes. It was my absolute pleasure to go across and sit with Mike Hedges while he was doing some mixing, the re-recording mixer of many of those Lord of the Rings films. I assume that you and Mike had quite a close working relationship. Were you working as dialogue editor on that?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I was on the second and third Lord of the Rings. I was cutting all of the human crowds. So there was someone cutting the orc crowds, and I was just doing the humans, which was, a lot of that was just battle vox. We would record a soccer team and, screaming past microphones and everyone acting that, they've been impaled with the sword and whatever. But so I'd bring my tracks to the mix, and Mike was, as he was the dialogue mixer, there were 3 dialogue, effects and music mixer on those big films, and I was working with Mike on them, and we had a great time working to that. Especially I think the funnest scene was a scene where we were panning these dialogues, because those big flying dinosaur things that would pick up soldiers and fling them across the screen, and so we were madly panning them all over the screen.
Well, interestingly, some of my most prized souvenirs come from the Foley set, actually, of Lord of the Rings, because Mike gave me a tour of the studios when I went over to see him at Weta, and I've got some coins. I've got some genuine Lord of the Rings coins, which they sit on my shelf, and I'm very delighted with. Anyway, we could go on for ages about this kind of stuff. What did the first version of EdiCue or its predecessor look like back in, what would it be, 2006, 2007? Was it a simple script, a patch for an existing program, or was it something that you built from the ground up?
Well, yeah, it was an interesting little how it came about, because before I built EdiCue, I had this program called EdiChart. It was a Mac OS and Windows app that I built for mixers predominantly in LA who weren't comfortable. You know, you were playing tracks off Pro Tools, but they were still used to playing in the days when the tracks were played off magnetic tape in the back room. And so for them to know where clips started and end, they would have printed out in front of them. They would actually be manually created by an assistant. And so I'd created this program that would print your Pro Tools tracks to PDF, and they could, convert half a tree into these charts. And yeah.
Wonderful. I remember when I started in the industry as an assistant film dubbing mixer, those charts, they were either a work of art or you'd be completely lost because the assistant film editor hadn't done a very good job.
Yeah. So I saw there had been a previous program that it would do this task, but it was no longer available, and there was all these people on the DigiDesign user conference who were screaming out for something. So I built this thing, EdiChart. But anyway, coming back to EdiCue, what had happened was one of my EdiChart clients, Sharp Sound Studios in Vancouver, they came up and said to me and sent me an email and said, why can't you, if we put all these clips on a Pro Tools track and all our ADR cues, can you print them out, but print them out as a cue sheet rather than as a dubbing chart? I thought, oh yeah, that shouldn't take too long. So, funnily enough, EdiCue looked quite a bit like EdiChart in its first iteration, because I just moved a few knobs about, and it just and options for printing out an actor, director, or engineer type PDFs, and that's how EdiCue came about.
I just had a traumatic flashback to being in university in the mid-90s, and we're learning how to nonlinear edit on a D-Vision system, I think it was, and then it printed out an EDL, and I had to enter all this CMX EDL manually into this keyboard, and I had to spool up these 1-inch tape drives in another room, and it would so much easier now. So much. This may be a somewhat self-evident question, but it's the Edi prefix is now iconic in our world here. What was the reasoning behind it, and how did you land on the specific names EdiCue, EdiPrompt, EdiLoad?
Well, yeah, the first Edi, well, someone said to me, all your Edi babies, but the first one was EdiTrace, which was a website. So that was where I was talking about having a program that could compare EDLs, which developed during Quiet American Lord of the Rings. Because there were so many cracked plugins back in there on OS 9, I decided to create a pay-per-use website, basically. And I called that EdiTrace, like Edi tracing kind of thing. And so when it came to releasing EdiChart, I thought, I thought it would be handy to actually have some part of the name recognizable as a kind of a brand. So yeah, I just went to EdiChart, and EdiCue came along and went, oh, well, you're queuing. So, and then, yeah, EdiPrompt for prompting the actor, and EdiLoad because it loads and converts lots of files, and that's how they came about.
So let's dig down in. Now we have the podcast covers a whole spectrum of production here, but for listeners who aren't as involved in post-production, how would you describe what EdiCue does that a simple spreadsheet or a paper log couldn't? What's the magic of the automation process?
Well, the main difference between EdiCue and the predecessors using a spreadsheet program or that kind of database thing is EdiCue was the first to store the data. Initially, it was in Pro Tools only, but now it's Nuendo as well. But to store that data on a audio track was intentional, and that's the key, in that you can actually see your ADR cues as you're editing, and it's also handy when a mixer needs to pre-mix the dialogue and, hey, the ADR isn't all ready, but you can give them the cue tracks in the dialogue session, and then they can see as they're mixing where ADR is going to land, and they know why there's fill and all of that. But the main magic about putting your cues in a Pro Tools session, when you recut your session to match the new picture version, you can recut your cues to match the new pictures as well. And it's a lot simpler to drag out a clip and fix a clip than looking at timecode numbers in a spreadsheet. So it's just a much more usable way of seeing your cues and interacting with them.
Mm.
So EdiCue became the industry standard for generating cue sheets in Pro Tools initially, Mark, but now you also cater for Nuendo. But were there specific design philosophies like embracing open formats such as XML or AAF and compatibility with all DAWs that from the outset you believed were key to its widespread adoption?
Well, yeah, it was key to adopt basically all the different formats that people were using to display those visual cues during the actual ADR record. And something that happened at the time was there was a lot of studios in London that were using the Colin Broad streamer, the VS1, and EdiCue just happened to come out at that time, and it was just a simple way for creating your cues then in the Pro Tools timeline, export via EdiCue and be able to pop those cues into the VS1, rather than, I know Colin had created, I think it was a Windows app to be able to key in all those numbers. But obviously using EdiCue was a lot simpler. And I think that was kind of where EdiCue got known, was in England first, and then it grew in popularity in America.
I mean, it's funny to think back to the days of the early to mid 2000s, when taking timeline and media data from the picture editor was still such a hit and miss process. I remember only too well in the 1990s the fragile process of receiving omphs from a picture editor on jazz drives, and then having to spend hours just compiling the media before you could even start an edit or even get to the mix, because omph 1s rarely work straight away. In comparison, we saved a lot of time with omph 2s, which now I think about it probably appeared around about the same time as EdiCue was launched. Would that be right?
Oh yeah. It was an interesting time. It actually reminds me, we were actually using the DAR sound stations at Labsonics at the time with the series Water Rats we were working on, and I remember getting a jazz, it was the same as jazz drive from the picture editorial, and trying to get it to load into this new conversion app that DAR had created. And so I ended up having to send the jazz drive off to England so that they could get it to work. And they eventually came with an update, and it worked for another 2 episodes, and then it fell over again. So I think we kind of gave up. But we spent a lot of time, trying to get that, and it's pretty remarkable that it's that it works so well as it does, really.
So EdiPrompt deals with the often very rushed process of voiceover recording, where there's lots of moving parts and things to keep track of. How does it reduce error and stress for both the actor and the supervising editor?
Well, yeah, as I was saying before, one of the key things it does is it puts the text up on the screen, so the actor doesn't have to look in 2 places at once when they're performing. So a lot about recording ADR is to get the actor comfortable and provide them with a way that they like to record their ADR. So by being able to give those visual cues during the record is imperative. And also what EdiPrompt does is it allows the recording engineer to locate to each viewpoint and rename the record track, which is imperative because having to do that stuff manually takes away from you being with the actor. And the main thing, of course, with any ADR session is you need to be as prompt and on time with. You don't want to delay the actor. You want to be on top of it. And when the actors are ready to go, you want to just go and record. And you want to have those files that you're recording named correctly so that they can be traced back to the paperwork for the dialogue editor.
So EdiLoad seems to be about the macro view of a project's sound and also the amount of material and metadata involved in the process must have increased exponentially since the inception of the product, because we're now regularly recording dozens of tracks on set, and final mixes can have hundreds of tracks in place for mixdown. How does EdiLoad help a supervising sound editor or a re-recording mixer understand the scope and the content of what's coming into a session before they even press play, and remedy what's oftentimes a bit of a mess?
Well, yeah, there's, as I was saying before, there's quite a few functions in EdiLoad, but the two key things that come into play there would be its ability to clean up and edit the decision list. Now, that could come in as an EDL file, which is a text-based document, or it can load in an AEF or an XML from Premiere Pro. And so you can very quickly remove from that edit or that timeline all of the temp effects and temp music and that kind of thing. The other aspect to that is usually the picture editor is editing with just one or two of the tracks that were recorded on location, which would be the mix track that the location recordist has created. So on location, for those who maybe are not that familiar with it, a location recordist will have a hard disk recorder, and they will be recording maybe one or two boom mics and a lapel mic, or maybe even two lapel mics. For some actors, if they're hard to record with the costumes they're wearing, and so you've got several actors on screen, you can have 10, 12 tracks recording at a time, and the recordist will create a mix of that. And so then when the picture editor or the assistant editor is loading those tracks into the picture edit machine, they'll quite often just load in the mix track and cut with that, because obviously they don't want to be dealing with lots and lots of tracks during the picture edit. And so when the edit is then passed over to the sound editors, EdiLoad allows them to reconstitute all of those tracks that were recorded on location to match the picture edit.
Mark, as a developer, how do you approach the task of ensuring seamless compatibility between your tools and the constantly updating ecosystems of major workstations like Pro Tools and Nuendo? It seems like, every 5 minutes there's a new version.
Well, yes, to be honest, I don't really get a chance to test every function of all my apps with every update of all those doors and operating systems. Obviously, as soon as there's something that comes up, I can jump on to releasing an update. Most of my clients are on the other side of the world from me, so quite often I can have something ready the next morning for them if it gets reported to me. But the one thing that has taken the most time over the last 10, 15 years to update for would be Apple macOS updates, which was also Windows as well, but the move from 32-bit to 64-bit, and then also moving processors again, now this time from Intel to ARM. It takes a lot of time, not only just updating your application, but also having to update the libraries that the application uses to be able to, say, load a AEF and such like. And also with the changes with Apple, with all of its security, you can say enhancements, but there are huge amounts of loops we now have to jump through to be able to release an application for it to be able to actually open up and run on macOS. So I think that's the main thing that's really impinges on your development time, unfortunately.
I can only imagine. And difficult question, but beyond saving time, how do you think these tools have reduced errors in the complex handover process between picture editing, ADR, Foley, and then the sound mixing?
I think the main thing would be with EdiLoad, I've given the user a lot of options to be able to manipulate the data in that, which may seem a little bit overwhelming for someone when they first come to it, but it allows you to repair edit lists. Say if a location recordist hasn't set the role names correctly, or they've didn't realise, that maybe it's their first job and they didn't realise they were meant to set a unique role name for each day and such like. EdiLoad's able to use different metadata fields to be able to reconstitute and assemble those location files. Yeah, I think that's the main time saver. Well, it's a make and break deal, because if you can't reconstitute those location audio files automatically, it's a very big job to have to do that manually, of course.
And off the back of that, do you think that your tools have helped to level the playing field so that smaller post-production houses and freelance editors can operate with kind of the same organizational efficiency as large studios? And I think that's something that Neil and I both celebrate and lament from a training and industry health aspect, that what used to take a whole team of people and a massive financial outlay can now be completely accomplished in a small pocket studio by one person.
Well, yeah, it definitely helps one person, or even, say, a 3-person team, which would have previously needed, say, 12. When I was working on Peter Rapp, one of the last films I worked on, we were doing, I think we did 15 screenings of that film before it was released. Some of the temp mixes Andy did in the Media Composer, but the other ones we were doing actually on Pro Tools systems and mixing them on a system. But because of all the processes that we had set up, we were able to get delivery of a film over the course of, say, 2 days. And within 3 days of the first one turning up, we would have a whole new, completely recut, reconformed, re-edited and remixed, ready for another temp screening. It's amazing what these systems have allowed us to do. But I will say, though, I think it's the unfortunate part of it is that before these systems, you would rely on assistants. And unfortunately, that was their way of people getting onto the job and understanding the process to be able to assist someone and see what they're doing. And, so I kind of feel for the people that are trying to get into the industry, there's not so many of those kind of jobs around.
That's a really, really good point.
Yeah, and I can see what you're saying with the turnarounds, especially for a lot of these streaming series now, that they're basically making whole films each episode. What would have normally been the production load of a feature film, and they're doing that over and again for a whole series. That your type of products just make that possible. It just wouldn't really be possible otherwise without massive teams, like you say.
Yeah, exactly.
What would you say, this is just an aside question here, but what's the most surprising or unconventional way you've seen someone use one of your applications? Because sound designers and editors seem rather prone to taking tools and breaking them in unorthodox ways. And just, I guess as an aside as well, I see that you have an integration with Pyramix. Is EdiLoad used for, say, classical recordings where you're having, multiple takes that you need to merge together and rearrange?
Well, for your first question, the thing that came to mind was work on Mad Max 4, and that was just such a train wreck in itself. We were doing supposedly a final mix, but it was just a really expensive, fancy temp mix. There was no way, the film wasn't, it was so far from being locked off. And so we had 3 assistant editors working on it at Stage 1 in Sydney. And they were working through the night, 24-hour shift kind of thing. And we were still printing dubbing charts because the effects tracks were coming from 2 different, I won't go into the politics of everything that happened on that thing, but basically they needed to print charts so that they had some kind of idea of what was coming up, what fader on the DSP. And EdiChart had an interesting thing where you could merge multiple tracks together, so it would be showing what would be coming up a bus, so to speak, or if you had assigned multiple outputs of a Pro Tools session up one fader, it would show one track of what was coming effectively up that fader. And there was just something about the way that one of the assistants had kind of grouped things and exported the text file from Pro Tools. I was just, it was probably 1 o'clock in the morning or something, and I was going, what are you doing? But we were in such desperate state of just trying to keep the wheels on the track that, that was something that came to mind.
Yeah, I think that film's begging for a behind-the-scenes documentary because so much happened there.
Yeah, but in answer to the Pyramix, merging came to me very early on when I still had my EdiTrace website, and we formed a deal to basically they put my tracing algorithm actually inside Pyramix, and so that they could do a recut within the track. And I guess it would have been the first DAW that had something built in like that. It was quite revolutionary at the time. I do know a lot of music editors would use Pyramix, and they were using it on Lord of the Rings. But how much of it was used for classical reconforms, I'm not sure.
Mark, what would you say was the single most difficult technical challenge that you faced in developing these apps?
The trickiest thing for me would have been to get a solid integration with Pro Tools. And I'd been begging for Avid to create an interface, which they have since, or recently in the last couple of years, they've created the Pro Tools scripting library, which is really awesome. But before then, there was no way for me to be able to directly read and write a Pro Tools session. I was having to, if I wanted to create a Pro Tools session with ADR cues, I'd have to create a AEF and a mute audio file, and then you'd generate a audio file that was linked to these mute audio files, which is just really crazy. So I basically took it on to reverse engineer the Pro Tools session file format. Avid had released a way to be able to do that with the 32-bit WAVs, which was what was used in Titan, created by Synchro Arts. But they never released it for 64-bit, and I think that's partly why Synchro Arts never created a 64-bit version of Titan. So the trickiest thing would have been for me, and not being formally trained as a computer software engineer, managing to be able to not only read and find out where the data is stored in a Pro Tools session file, but actually create one and kind of fool Pro Tools into thinking that it's opening a file created by Pro Tools, was months of tedious, really just working out one little parameter at a time and creating basically a test app to be able to negotiate and find where these things were stored. And it was like one of those hurrah moments when I actually got it to work. And because of that, I think my apps have come to a whole new level because of, it can now create a queue session creating with clip groups that you can color code however you want, and it can read Pro Tools sessions and create whole new workflows. And I'm sure my apps are used in all sorts of fanciful ways that I never hear about, but I'm creating the tools for editors to do all sorts of things like that.
I mean, it is remarkable that you've created this, and as you just said, without a formal software engineering education. But of course, they wouldn't look the same way as they do without your experience as a sound editor. Now, how did you manage the demands of being both a working sound editor on major projects and the lead developer of a software suite simultaneously? And do you still dialogue edit or mix projects?
Well, yeah, it was quite tricky. Working on those really demanding films, like, you get into the mixing period of any major film and you're working, 7 days a week, 12-hour shifts at minimum. But so obviously during that time, all I'm doing is fielding emails, but also because you're working freelance, it did actually work out because you'd go for weeks, sometimes at very short notice, that your job had got cancelled or it got delayed another 2 weeks because of attempt screening that didn't go too well. So, that allowed me to develop this and, eventually made a bit of an income from it to be able to tide me over. But now, no, I don't do any dialogue work. I focus now purely on the software development, and it's allowed me to take these apps to a whole new level, and really grateful for the opportunity to be able to do that.
Mark, was there a distinct tipping point when you realised that EdiCue wasn't just a tool that you were using on your own projects or with colleagues who you were working on large films, but was there something that told you that the entire industry was starting to benefit from it? And what did the transition from that sort of personal tool that you designed almost in a back bedroom, as it were, to a major commercial product? How did that feel? What did that involve?
Well, it's interesting with EdiCue. I never developed that for purely myself. It was requested by another studio, and I had a very quick and rough and ready version for them to beta test. But I think I probably released it, say, within the month. And but yeah, I guess it was great to see how it took off. And it's not so much developing the application, it's developing the workflow. Nothing else at the time was creating cues in a Pro Tools session like that. So it's kind of funny that, I'd probably only been in the industry about 5 years, and all of a sudden now you've got people all around the world doing the same, But yeah, certainly I have created apps. One in particular I created for Peter Rabbit, where your listeners are probably familiar with the film, and that it was part animation, part live action. And it was the first time I'd worked on a film like that, and I actually got brought onto it by Christian Gazelle, the picture editor who I'd worked with on Happy Feet 2. Happy Feet 2, of course, was purely animated film, so you record all the dialogues first. I had the fortunate job of cutting the dialogues, which is you're creating a radio play with George. George Miller that was another dream job. Coming up with something from scratch. Which you don't do as a sound editor working in film and TV. You're always following the picture edit. But yeah, Christian got me on to Peter Rabbit because he was kind of scratching his head like, how are we going to do this? Because even the director Will hadn't worked with animation before. And he was shooting the live action at the time in Sydney at Centennial Park. And I got brought on. And, the thing with these big films is you've got to create a pipeline and a way of working so that when the director comes to sit down with you on the first day, you're ready to go. And you've got, say, all the recordings for, a particular scene in a session, and you can just start cutting with them and create something. We were like, how's this animation dialogue going to work? Is it going to live in Media Composer or is it going to live in Pro Tools? And, you've got to make that decision pretty early on because you can't just have it, ready overnight. But funnily enough, it got decided for us because when Will had finished the principal shoot, he was like, oh, okay, well, I'm off to LA now. And we're like, huh? Everyone was saying, even production was like, we thought you were staying in Sydney. And then I was like, no, I'm off to LA. So all of a sudden, there was no other way but to have to cut it in Media Composer so that they could share the edit between LA and Sydney. And so then my job came about basically feeding editorial with files that could then come back to us, and we could then, I'll explain that we did the animation record, say, with 2 or 3 mics, and we created systems with editorial so that we could create these, say, 3-track WAVs, and then I'd actually embed them with metadata, field recorder metadata, as if it had come from a location recorder. It would go to Media Composer and then come back to us in an AF, and then we could use the field recorder workflow to be able to flip out the mics. So that was one interesting process that we'd created for that movie. And the other one was during the actual edit, we still had the script department on the film. And so they were pumping out scripts to us. And of course, you're going, well, okay, so which line's new? What do we need to record? So I'd created an app because EdiCue can import shooting scripts. So I created an app to be able to import 2 scripts and compare them. Or actually, it would import a script and kept a library of them. So a new script came along, it would hunt back through all the previous scripts and be able to track, so if there were multiple records, you could know which script a line had been recorded and which ones were new, and that would pump the new lines out to FileMaker, and you would then go to a session, in LA, or you send it to Sony LA and say, record these lines. This is what we need. So that's one app that I created for that film, which has never got released. But yeah, apart from that, they were all intended for release.
How has the feedback from sound editors around the world shaped the evolution of your software's features over the years? I mean, we think of these tools as industry standard, but your user base must be relatively small compared to the overall number of users that something like Nuendo or Pro Tools has across the music or motion picture industry as a whole. I'm assuming you get fairly direct input from your end users.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And, where possible, I accommodate where I can. A lot of the apps are shaped from user requests. So, you get to know your users and you build up a rapport with, some really key editors working on big productions. And it's an absolute honor to be able to get that feedback from those jobs and implement them in a way. But, it obviously, I'm sure it has helped that I've got a background in that industry, because, sometimes you'll get requests and you're going, well, no, is that a one-off or is that some quirky thing you're just doing? And, you obviously have to assess what you think's going to be used by multiple people and is good. You don't want to go down a tangent and then end up with a feature that isn't working or, can't progress to something bigger or that kind of thing.
I've got two questions here, which I'm going to kind of merge together. So our industry is evolving greatly, and it has evolved greatly over the past few years by necessity, as COVID brought in a lot of challenges for the industry. But one thing that's come of it is the development of many tools that facilitate remote working. And you reworked some of your tools to enable actors to readily record ADR from just about anywhere. Do you sense that this kind of workflow is here to stay? And I'm kind of assuming it is. And what kind of feedback have you received about this from the industry?
Yeah, during COVID, during the lockdowns, I worked with the guys from Todd.io who had this iPad app, or iPad or iPhone, iOS app, so that actors could record their dialogue themselves. And so, I came up with an update for EdiCue quite quickly so that it would export video files of each cue point, which you could load into their app. That was obviously a huge help at the time, because you had all of these productions that had just been stalled, but they were still in post. And there were still deadlines for these supervisors to meet. So all this ADR obviously had to get recorded. And so it was quite an ingenious thing to find out different ways of doing it. There was another way that I know some clients had installed EdiPrompt on a laptop and just shipped them to actors' homes, and they could open up the laptop and they control the laptop remotely.
Mark, inevitably we have to raise the topic of AI and its result in automation. Where do you see the role of artificial intelligence in the future of tools like yours? Could AI eventually generate cue sheets or spot effects by simply analysing a picture cut compared to the rushes it's created from? Also, for software development, are there generic APIs for AI integration for tools like yours? I'm assuming you wouldn't have to develop an AI from scratch.
It's an evolving thing how those tools are getting used today, with people working more and more from home. And so, it's an interesting time now working with AI. I don't think AI is certainly going to take over our jobs, as, some people might think. It's you still need to direct AI. Even when I use it, you have to be very specific about what you're asking. And so I don't think it's ever going to be able to create cue sheets per se, or anything like that. But one thing that I have integrated into EdiCue recently, which was the release of EdiCue version 5 back in June of this year, was the option to be able to transcribe a guide track and create ADR cues. Now, by no means do I say those cues are ready to work with, but they're a good starting point. So it creates clips on a Pro Tools session, and you can actually select more than one AI model. So each model will come up with a different interpretation, and you can select the best one and create your cues from that. And so I think that's a very valuable thing. And I think if you're specific about how you use it, I think it's a marvelous tool. And in terms of how I've implemented it, you don't write the AI engine yourself as such. There's an API which you can utilize, and other post-production tools use that, just like, say, Pro Tools have with their text-to-speech offering.
Now, you won an Emmy in the Outstanding Achievement in Engineering Development category for EdiCue in 2015, and then another Emmy in 2018 for EdiLoad, so surely it can only be a matter of time before your software development work is recognised for a technical Oscar. But when you look at EdiCue, EdiPrompt and EdiLoad being used on virtually every major film and television show today, what are you most proud of? Is it the time saved, the errors prevented, or simply the fact that you solved a problem that for years had plagued your peers?
Oh, yeah. Well, it's that I've been able to contribute to the industry, to allow editors to go home at a reasonable hour, rather than having to queue till 3 a.m. or something for the next day's record. It's been an absolute honour to be able to be part of this process, and to be able to utilise my love for sound, which I never thought I'd leave, with my curiosity in software development and fixing problems, I guess. And it's been an absolute treat.
Well, on behalf of those editors that have been grateful for the time you've saved them with your software, not having to stay till 3 a.m. in the morning, I'm going to say a big thank you. And I also want to say thank you for the time you've given us on the show today, Mark. It's been great to talk with you.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
The link to Mark's company website, Sounds in Sync, is on today's show notes page, and this link will give you details of the products we've been talking about today, as well as the different types of licensing that's available, including rental options and educational discounts. Also on the show page are contact details for Jason and me as experienced and enthusiastic dialogue editors for hire, my work as a sound producer, helping ambitious filmmakers by acting as a consultant and overseeing their film soundtracks from pre-production right through to post-production, as well as a link to the live online coaching sessions and workshops that we run on sound design and DaVinci Resolve, which we like to think of as being relevant and useful for all craft creatives such as directors and picture editors, and not just sound professionals.
It's our goal with this podcast series to educate listeners from all backgrounds about the underappreciated, wider role that sound plays in life, as well as in the film and television industry, and to also develop a sound language and style of dialogue that filmmakers can use to more easily communicate with each other about sound for moving pictures. If you like what you've heard today, please be sure to subscribe to the podcast and leave comments about what would be helpful to you and your work, and who you'd like to hear from on the show. And lastly, as ever, thanks for listening.
The Apple and Biscuit Show is written, produced, and presented by Jason Nicholas and Dr. Neil Hillman. It is edited and mixed by Dr. Neil Hillman.
Apple and Biscuit Show.